This is going to be our final session working with this subject in this sort of acrylic tonal fashion. So last week, the previous session, we pretty much sort of got to a decent point with the body of the bird. We are going to return to it slightly at the very end of this session, but primarily we're going to be focusing on the pot behind, basically the sort of background aspects. The first thing I want to do, in terms of brushes, I'm using, I've got a kind of smallish flat brush and then a much smaller pointed brush. I just want to do a slight sort of glaze using a tiny bit of water mixed in, just to darken this little section behind the back edge of the pot. And then working on the other side of the pot now. Just want to reinforce anywhere that needs to go darker. Because there's a slightly textured panel, we've got some kind of slightly sort of spotty bits. So if you get any overlaps like that, you don't have to worry too much. As one of the final things we'll be doing is just kind of neatening all our edges. Sort of addressing and neatening the edges. Using the diluted paint, I'm also able to create a slightly softened edge. Which is, when we start to kind of really refine it, we're going to be looking for overlapping edges. So something like the pot going into the background, we want to feel a bit blurrier than the bird in the foreground. By using diluted paint, so just diluting it with water, I can essentially do some glazing passes, which is a bit trickier in acrylic to handle than in oil paint, just because it dries so fast. But you can do it, and the advantage is you can actually work kind of backwards and forwards, so this will dry reasonably quickly, and if I need to work back some kind of light scumbles over these glazes, that's quite quickly manageable, which is definitely a distinct advantage. Obviously with a oil painting glaze, you know, you've got to wait till it dries to return to it. These washy passes help to create the texture of the pot. So one of the main things we're thinking about with still life always is texture. So we're now moving into one of the trickier aspects, which is this. Getting this lip of the pot to work. It has this sort of slight form, and we want to sort of suggest that it's important that we try to capture that sense of its form. Again, I'm primarily using glazes here. We've also got, so once we get to this point in the pot, there's a sort of tapering of that highlight down to being almost kind of non-existent. It actually, once it reaches this point here, it's pretty much totally cut across. So it's starting to function a little bit better, that lip of that pot now. We want to go back in and work against those darks just to create a little bit more form. It's just kind of like sort of slightly molded almost, kind of moving up. And go back to this side here. I might actually swap to the slightly bigger brush. Yeah, it's not working too badly. And working our way back towards here, we're kind of building up to trying to get our highlights in place. We don't want to put the highlights until more of this, I guess, slightly more boring modeling is done. And before doing those highlights, I also want to go drop down to this wing. Get a nice overlap. With the pot. At the moment it's a bit too ragged, that edge, so we want to make sure it's reading correctly. There's a kind of distinct form. Helps that it's a little bit lighter, but it's not just a case of what value it is, it's also the sharpness of the edge. And likewise, this little shadow here on the wing behind separates the wing from the torso of the bird. So while that's wet, I just want to, I've kind of got a little bit of black because I just want to get it to feel kind of smudgier into that dark behind, so that the foreground, well, not the foreground, but the front of the bird's torso feels crisper. So we want this edge here, the edge of the breast of the bird, to feel sharper than that wing form behind, which we're trying to get to smudge. Kind of blur a bit more. Like that. So it just starts to feel a little bit more, sort of recedes essentially, that edge. there like that. So you can see it kind of just feels slightly more pushed back that way. You can do the same up there as well. It's tricky though because I've gone, say up there, I've gone a little bit too light. So I don't want to make it excessively light. I just want the edge to be sharper, so you really have to match your values well. That's something that tends to be a bit easier in oil paint because your paint's wet. You can kind of adjust it, whereas with acrylics, as you can see, it sort of can be a little bit trickier, that sort of thing. But we're just about there with all the kind of primary forms. The kind of basis of their structure, and we just want to go in and last thing we're going to do is just refine all the highlights. We're mostly going to be working with white paint, almost pure white paint in the last few minutes. So we've got highlights all the way kind of along the rim of the pot, and then we also want to do a kind of final build up block in of the lightest parts of the bird's torso. But otherwise it's looking pretty good, so reasonably happy. One thing actually just caught my eye is I just want to, up here's gone a little bit, spotty from the grain of the wood, so I just wanted to get rid of that. It would have been disruptive. So we're at a point now where we can clean the brush off just with our water, and then pick up a good amount of your paint. Obviously the thicker your paint is, the easier this will be, but you want to go in and just sort of more dragging strokes build up some really thick sections of white highlight. Same on the other side, there's like a few really tiny little notches down this rim. If you go over anywhere, so like I went over slightly there, you can just grab a little bit more black back. So that's not too bad for our lighter portion of our pot. The last place we want to put some white is just into these internal highlights. There's a few points where the beaten metal in the inside of the pot catches a bit of light. again, I've kind of slightly overlapped a bit too much into this darker section, but it's easy enough to correct that just by working kind of back over some darker paint to find that curve again. So I don't want them to be too discrete, so too separated, those highlights, so just incorporating some slightly lighter tones into the rest of the metal. Just a little bit over here, that kind of sense of a almost like internal little reflection. In the original it's kind of, that warmth is brought in by the colour shift. There's actually like a little red shift there, which we don't quite have the luxury of working in monochrome, but if you can capture a sense of it with monochrome, then that's working really well. So I'm pretty much there. The last thing I'm going to do again is just, as I said, totally clean my brush off, pick up a lot of pure paint, just relay in these lightest feathers, just really get them to glow. The final build up of white paint, and just a tiny bit more in here. Just want to lift the center of that neck there a little bit, just some of these sort of creased feathers, and tiny bit more in here, and I think that's it. We're done. So that's about the level you want for this sort of tonal study. If you were preparing for a painting, this is a nice level of detail to go for. So it's a study. You could build this into something that's more refined, but you could sell a piece like this, obviously. But the process is kind of most useful for a study that you might scale up. It's sort of like a proof of concept. You can kind of test how the piece looks in this sort of tonal study in paint. Using acrylic, you can do it in quite a lot of layers in a single sitting because the way it dries. The main advantage of it really over oil paint is that drying time. But yeah, you can fiddle with it more obviously like that, but something like this is a good level that you can build up towards. And that's it for this series. So we'll be starting something new after the break. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it, you found it useful. As always, you can subscribe to the channel for more videos. We release them on a very regular basis. And if you want kind of further tuition or complete support, you can click the link through to OCAD's website and sign up to get support from myself and other tutors on the projects you complete. But yeah, that's it. Hopefully you find it useful, and I'll see you guys soon.